Here we are, last exit on the left. Hard cut. We were talking about all sorts of things before this got edited, people who are watching this. But it's myself, Forbes, no Brandon today, but we are with CNP president. Eventually, I think by the time people see this, candidate for governor of the great state of California, Professor Michael Loebs. How you doing, Michael?
I'm holding together pretty well today. How about yourself?
Pretty good. It's a beautiful California day. So, and I'm in the south. You guys are up north. It is a whopping 68 degrees, and yeah, it's blue skies. So we can't complain.
That's about how balmy as we are up here too. Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the things about California is the microclimates. Even though Loebs and I are close to each other, there's probably like 10 different climates in between the area. It's amazing. I learned a lot about how the impacts of hills, valleys, and coastal breezes since I've been here.
I love to vacation up to San Francisco. Me and my wife always take a road trip over there. And a lot of times we stay over in Tiburon, which is right across the bridge. And it's really funny because you get over that bridge and like you can go from San Francisco, which is like 60 degrees, kind of cold, get to Tiburon, not that far away. It's about 79. It's amazing. Like, again, you can just see the other city and it's not that far.
Yeah, and it's the hill range, it's the mountain range up there up in the North Bay. You ever done the ferry from Tiburon back to the city?
That's actually what we do all the time because we don't want to drive. So we drive to Tiburon. Oh, yeah. There's a place called the Tiburon Lodge. We stay there. It's like a 2-minute walk to the ferry, and so again we jump on the ferry and then just go back and forth like that. Yeah, it's so comfortable and nice. It's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. When my wife worked at Lucasfilm, my daughter, very fortunate, got to go to preschool at Lucasfilm. So we tell her she went to Jedi preschool. But she'd always take the ferry from Vallejo over to San Francisco. And that's the thing she remembers the most, my daughter. Not, walking by and seeing like Darth Vader or, things like that. No, it's taking the ferry. I guess we'll ask this. We'll transition to this. What are your stances on public transportation? And if you are elected governor, what would you do when it comes to public transportation?
I mean, like obviously, public transportation is a huge deal in many locations, especially dense locations. And I think here in San Francisco, in the Bay Area specifically, we definitely need to make use of all the transit resources we had. I think one of the worst things California did in the 50s and 60s was getting rid of things like the key system that used to run across the Bay Bridge, getting rid of the ferry system, and we really need to. I love the ferry system. I think it's fantastic. We have one of the best natural highways in the world right there in the smack center of the Bay Area, and then we just stopped using it. And it's interesting because I'm a big ferry rider myself, but even to this day, so the ferries in the Bay Area weren't restarted until the day after the '89 earthquake, because they had to check the tunnel for BART, they had to check the bridge. And so to this day, the ferry is run by the Water Emergency Transit Authority, even though the emergency was, 30 odd years ago now. We don't have
That's very interesting. I didn't know that.
Regional ferry board, which we really need to do. And I'm thrilled that the ferry has been coming back. We definitely need to, do more investment in trains. And of course, transit is always going to be tied to housing. I think one of the things we need to be making sure of is, housing developments along major transit corridors and at major stops. And not only that, but expanding transit to new places and building up housing and commerce around there. Because it's a lot easier and a lot cheaper to build new housing and commerce with a new train station or a new terminal rather than having to tear down everything that's already there. It's just a lot more work. It costs a lot more money. But I think transit is definitely one of those things that's very regional. I mean, the Los Angeles area just has very different types of needs and very different types of geography in terms of transit in the Bay Area. And of course, there are places that the density is just not enough to support a large-scale mass transit system. But I think definitely California's policies are going to have to be geared toward recognizing these distinctions. How to make transit effective in the Bay Area is different from how to make transit effective in, Lassen County or something like that. So just having that kind of view, and of course that can tie into the position I and the CNP have on the gas tax, which is of course related to transit funding, which we can also get into.
Yeah, because I mean that's a legitimate, like again, like we don't really have. I mean, like it's been criminal since like the 50s and 60s. I mean, both parties, Democrats and Republicans, were very happy to plant freeways in neighborhoods and cut them up left and right, and like had no real like equitable plan to actually make it like something like a first world country when it comes to like that kind of transportation. And neither has the federal government either. There's been no interest in that. There's been no drive for it. I mean, we've talked about like the high-speed rails for what, about 10 years, to go from like LA to San Francisco, and haven't seen anything of it. And what we got now is, I think, a watered down plan. I'm not even sure that's even active.
Yeah. The high-speed rail has just, I think high-speed rail is a fantastic, great idea that was executed as horribly as you could possibly execute such an important large-scale idea. It was just done so badly. And part of that was there was just such bad community. It was basically pushed by Sacramento as this great thing that was going to help all of California, but of course it fundamentally was pushed first on the Central Valley without a lot of communication, without a lot of back and forth. It becomes sort of that classic problem: before you give a gift to somebody, make sure they want it kind of thing. Because now they're saying it's going to be basically Merced to Bakersfield or something like that before they gave
something like that. Yeah, it's like it's not really like the grand dream it was before. Like the idea was you could hop the train in like LA, go to San Francisco, take X amount of minutes to get there. I mean, be like something like, again, well, most other normal countries have, Western Europe, Japan, for example.
Right, and I think the big problem you have in California is even just regular rail would help a great deal, but of course the problem is Amtrak California is grafted into the broader U.S. Amtrak system. And, they just, Joe Biden, Amtrak Joe just had his big announcement of the increased funding for Amtrak. And everybody's just like, this is absurd. There aren't enough people. There's not enough density in places between Chicago and Omaha that you want to fill in. It's going to be a money sink. And that almost certainly is true in the United States. But California separately is very different. If California were able to run its own independent, integrated train and bus network, and we didn't have to worry about funding the declining rail network of the United States, if all that funding could just stay here and we could build up California rail, and especially a California rail combined with a California bus network, I think that would really go a long way to integrating different parts of California together. Because right now the transit system throughout California is just so haphazard and so confusing, and it's just not at all planned or integrated together in any way, and that just encourages people to go back to the roads. And getting people off the roads is important. And I think something that's just not sold enough is this idea like, oh, why is my tax money paying for all this man's transit, for these roads and these ferries I don't take? And there needs to be this understanding that anyone who's taking a train or taking a ferry is a car who's not on the freeway while you're on the freeway. So even if you're still driving, those other people getting off the freeway into this alternate transit system makes your life easier. And it does the job a lot better than just saying, oh, we'll expand the 4-lane highway to a 5-lane highway. Because all that does is, in 6 months, all 5 lanes are filled instead of all 4 lanes. So we'll add a 6th lane, and then all 6 lanes get filled instead of 4 lanes. And it never actually increases the capacity of people getting where they want to go. It just means more of us can get stuck at the same time. So presenting these alternatives is necessary.
Yeah, that's pretty true, because if I remember right, I think they ran into that report in Britain when they're thinking about expanding their highways, and they're just like, no, actually, after a while, you're going to clog it up again. And so they decided to turn away from it, but Britain isn't really stuck in these kind of outmoded ideas like the USA is, even though Britain's not exactly that progressive.
The irony is the thing that they've said has helped traffic the most is those stop and go lights at the exit ramps when you're getting on. Yeah, those help more than, and you're right, if you expand the lanes, you just get more drivers. That is a statistical fact. And one thing about it's disappointing about California with the high-speed rail, and I say this first, when I lived in Massachusetts, the Big Dig was a big disaster. I don't know if you ever heard of this, but it was mammoth, undertaking that didn't work. But once it was up, it created such a boom. And the other thing it does is it creates pride in where you live. When you have a big infrastructure project that gets done. And the irony is with the Big Dig, it created all these neighborhoods that became like super like upscale, like tech companies moved in, like pharmaceutical companies, like all these MIT people started building businesses in the area where the Big Dig created these jobs. So when you said, how you build the trains around these communities, mass transit is a really good boom to a local economy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, it does tie the other communities. I mean, like, for example, like, my wife's Japanese. I have a place in Japan. We go back and forth, as much as we can, except of course with COVID. And anyway, her town is kind of a small town and village, but it does have its own train connect in Ojima, Shizuoka Prefecture. So we can go from this like kind of small, like it's not a village. It sounds like a little too quaint, but it's basically a very small town, and you can just get on the train. You connect it into the main city of Shizuoka, and then vice versa. People come over there. If there's going to be a festival or something like that, or something of interest. There's enough flow, and actually, I believe it would be an economic, kind of boom too, because like certain areas that were not so easily accessible, people were just like, hey, I'm going to go out there for like a day, come back, makes it easy for everyone, no big deal.
Right, and I think one of the big things about transit development, especially as you're talking about with the high-speed rail, is, and I think a lot of this is justified. There is, of course, a concern among people in the Central Valley, because of course the whole idea is you develop this high-speed rail, commuters who work in the Bay Area, who work in Sacramento, can get houses out in Modesto, or they can get houses out in even closer in Stockton or something like that, and have this ready transit connection. And then of course the fear is people move out there, housing prices go up, the people who live in the Central Valley can't afford to live in there. Like basically what will happen to the Central Valley, what happened to those of us in the Bay Area. I've lived in the Bay Area my whole life, and in 1984 my parents bought the house I grew up in for $88,000. Like you could get a house in the Bay Area for $88,000 at that time, which of course is just an impossibility now. And so there is,
even with inflation adjusted, I mean, that's not that much. I mean, with inflation adjusted, I'd be probably what, 300 maybe, if even that.
It was a perfectly reasonable working class house when we got it in 1984. And I think there's definitely a worry among people in the Central Valley that as you basically attempt to turn the Central Valley into a gigantic commuter village for Sacramento and the Bay Area and eventually Los Angeles, that it's going to fundamentally change the culture there. It's going to change the economy there. And I think there's a deep concern about that, which is justified. I think there's also the problem that in a lot of ways, even as those cities shift more to supporting Democrats, as places like Merced, like Fresno tend to be a little more open to supporting Democrats, the counties themselves are broadly still Republican. And you have this conflict between these two parties, which is why I think what you really need is you need to break out of this Democrats versus Republicans. Oh, this is going to allow more Democrats to move to our city. Oh, this is going to decrease the power of a Republican, board of supervisors type of thing. You need to break out of that mentality and just sit down and say, what's going to work well for this community? What's going to work well for California? Not what's going to give the Democrats a victory, not what's going to give the Republicans a victory, but what's going to give California a victory? What's actually going to work well as a policy for California? Which I just think is really difficult when you have this system built on these two parties in constant competition with each other, and it doesn't become about California at all. It becomes about which of us can get more points for Team Blue and Team Red. And so I think really the Central Valley and the failure of high-speed rail is just a symptom of that basically these two camps just couldn't find any way to make this work in their political ideological struggle.
And most people are not so hyper-partisan. It's just that unfortunately the controlling entities are. I mean, it's just like the people elected, Democrats or Republicans, and by almost kind of this default, are going to be hyper-partisan. They're already built into that kind of culture. So, that the two-party system is so really problematic because, again, they are driving away the interests of a lot of people. I mean, like, you did say, like, for example, that, again, like, housing prices might go up because you have new people coming in and have money. But, I mean, it's just like it might not be such an influx. And also, too, again, we're kind of spreading people around a little bit more and people have easy ways to commute. Not everyone's just going to move there en masse because, like, I mean, yes, the Bay has been hit pretty hard, but, like in certain areas, it's like maybe people just want to have more of a quiet community. We can kind of, with a proper transit system, we can kind of spread people out and then also maybe kind of spread a little bit of wealth around too. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. There's not going to be these hyper concentrations, but from what I understand is that, like, what you're saying, I think is correct. You got a two-party system where Again, people are going to fight tooth and nail over every little scrap there because they want to maintain these stupid electorates, and these electorates of their their partisans. Again, like it's just poor leadership. It's not really again like about like whether or not this community is going to be developed. It's more about hey, can we score some points here against Newsom, or can we make the Republicans eat shit for a bit?
Right, and that's the only strategy that they're employing. And I mean, and it's harmful for the people. I mean, like, some people, especially in the Bay Area, or people who are from there, look at me weird when I say this, but I actually love Fresno. Every time I've gone to Fresno, I have a great time. The problem with Fresno is that nobody lives in downtown Fresno, or very few people live in downtown Fresno. You go to what used to be the promenade, in downtown Fresno on a Saturday or something, and it's abandoned. Like that area should be thriving. There are businesses, there are restaurants, there are bars. Chachansky Park is right down there. You should have people bustling there, but they don't because of the way housing is developed there. You don't have this sort of like urban core of housing producing people who put money into those local shops, put money into those local restaurants, put money into those local bars. And that's a big part of like CMP policy, is going back to businesses that are part of the community, that are owned by community members, and that's ultimately what you're trying to do, is you're trying to get that money into the community. And the point is, you don't want the Central Valley, you don't want up in like Siskiyou or something, people living off of Bay Area money. What you want is their own economy there, their own money, people with their own income spending their own money on local businesses who then reinvest that money into the community. And you can't do that as long as you say, what you're trying to do is just score political points, try to make Newsom look bad, try to make the Republicans look regressive. If that's what you're trying to do, you're not actually solving problems. You're just trying to score points on this board about who's winning, the Democrats or the Republicans. And I think that fundamentally causes us to lose sight of actual solutions that would help both California and the local community.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, I guess it goes into, when it comes to like this transit issue, I think it's just more of a symptom as opposed to a disease of the, how do I put this? It's more of a symptom of the disease that we have when it comes to this entire system, right? Because again, like the way it's set up right now in California and the nation to a general extent, you're having it where, again, like, there's not really any kind of clear thought process. There's not any clear discipline towards actually getting out there and like, trying to make improvements. It's scorekeeping. But I think on that note, since we've talked a lot about the Bay Area too, even though I don't think the Bay Area is nearly as bad when it comes, there is a major issue. I don't think it's nearly as bad as, say, like Los Angeles when it comes to homelessness. But like housing and homelessness, is a major thing in California. I believe that, you read some studies and like people are paying anywhere from 50 to 60% of their income towards rent. It's something astronomically high. What do you have in mind when it comes to trying to tackle like the housing crisis? Because again, like that's endemic and that's been under, Republicans and Democrats for like at least the last 20 years. I don't remember a period of time in any recent memory where there wasn't a housing problem in California. There's been booms and busts when it comes to housing prices, but we're having a major issue right now. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and I totally understand that. I sympathize with that. I myself pay about, 75% of my income to keep this apartment that I've lived in for 18 years. It's my home. I'm not going to leave now. I've lived here longer than anywhere else in my life, but if this is my income, this is what I have to put in to stay alive here. And I think part of the problem, housing ultimately is part of a broader California issue that I think comes down to the explosive growth California has had, especially since the 1970s. Like in a lot of ways, not just in housing, but our infrastructure has not kept up with our exploding population. There were 25 million people in California in the 1970s, and now there's about 40 million. And we're basically using the same infrastructure. We're using the same freeways. We're using the same housing plans. We're using the same water system. And these are the types of things that we need to be developing if we're going to make this a livable place. And so I think the answer to that is going to depend on a lot of different places. So one thing that you were talking about is spreading people out a little more. With all the jobs being located in just 3 or 4 parts of California, people congregate there, driving up housing prices in that area. Whereas in other places, you have no influx of business. And so then the housing problems there are completely different from the housing problems in major dense urban areas. So I think the answer to that question is going to have to require cooperation with local people who understand what kind of development do we need to have here, combined with a general overarching California-based housing plan. And I think some of the things you're going to have to do are going to be different in different areas. So, for example, in the Bay Area, people have talked about the idea of trying to put limits on ownership without some sort of residency, which maybe, you know, because that was definitely a big problem in the last few years, is major investors in the United States, in China, in Canada, buying up these apartment buildings. Because, you know, when I moved in here, my building was just owned by a person who owned a couple buildings. They couldn't afford to jack up the rent too much because they needed people coming in, moving in there, keeping that flow going. Whereas once things were owned by large corporations based in China or based in New York, they could afford to keep those buildings empty for months and months and months with these highly inflated rents because they were large corporations that could afford that sort of thing. I mean, right now here in San Francisco,
Right.
my building is literally 50% empty. The building across the street is literally 50% empty. Like, I can see half of the open apartments, while there are people outside, like sleeping in the street outside of a building where there's half the empty apartments. And part of that is because of this ability for people to, you know, hold out for higher rent. So, I mean, the answer is going to be different. In San Francisco, I think it probably would be good to have a tax on empty apartments. If you're going to sit there and keep the apartment empty, if the market mechanisms, which are supposed to keep rents lower when people aren't demanding them, aren't functioning properly, you need to make a market incentive, which is in essence, we're going to tax you for an empty apartment. It is not now in your best interest to keep a hyperinflated rent here. But it's going to look different if you're trying to, say, build new housing in Modesto, where maybe you do need some sort of investment from outside. So I think the answer to that is going to vary from place to place to a certain extent. And I think it's also going to vary based on what type of communities you're trying to build that housing in. Because I confess, it's a complicated issue. I'm both in favor of we need more housing, but I'm also opposed to the idea of simply going in and saying, hey, you people who live in this local area, we're going to build a bunch of new housing against your will, because I do happen to find that as undemocratic. Local communities should have a certain amount of local say in what's going on in their neighborhoods. Now, this can be problematic because it can also tie into issues like, you know, class and racial issues.
Well, there's also the NIMBY issue is the biggest thing. Not in my backyard. Like, there's NIMBYs all over the place. I mean, like, again, like, you know, Marin County, which is supposed to be this like super liberal enclave, like, you know, doesn't allow any kind of homeless shelters whatsoever, does everything possible to make sure that there is no real new developments because they want to keep their community exactly as is. So it really is, yeah, you're right. I mean, it runs into, you can have some harsh resistance. I mean, it's almost like, you know, back in the 60s, for example, like there was a lot of communities that did not want to desegregate, and pretty much the federal government had to kind of put its thumb on the scale a bit to kind of make pressure it a bit, even though, again, that never really panned out the way I think it was hoped for, but I mean, at least it was an attempt.
But I think NIMBYism is a complex issue because NIMBYism can mean we don't want you to build in Mill Valley, but it can also mean generations of people who live in the Mission here in San Francisco are asking, why are you tearing down my buildings so you can build condos for tech workers? This is the Mission. This has been la Mission for generations. And now you're going to tell us that against our will, we here in the Mission should be tearing down our 2- and 3-story buildings, which are inefficient to have along a major corridor next to BART stations, and say we're going to build it for, you know, a brand new generation of tech workers who may move in here for 5 years and get rich and then move away. And then the people who built their lives in the Mission for generations have been forced out to Antioch and can't come back anymore. So, I mean, I think NIMBYism is a double-edged sword. There's sort of, there's sort of the entitled NIMBYism, but there's also the NIMBYism that says we want to maintain this community that we've spent generations building up. And we don't really like the idea that city policy is now just deciding, well, no, you're condos now. You're condos now because we've just decided you're where the poorest housing is that we can knock down and make into wealthier housing, which is what happened in places in San Francisco like Dogpatch, which is what they've been trying to do in Bayview. And again, it's not all good or it's not all bad, but it's a complex issue. And it's not really an issue that you can solve, I think personally, with just sort of an ideological policy of we need more housing versus we need to maintain communities. It's going to be, everyone is going to be based on a series of, you know, contexts of the facts of that community and the interplay of how much do we need to build versus how much do we want to maintain the culture of a neighborhood that's been around for generations. You know, I mean, and I have to admit, like, I would feel pretty irritated if tomorrow they were just like, yo, we're going to tear down San Francisco Chinatown because we've just decided we need more 20-story condo buildings. I think that would be problematic when it's one of the most historic and, you know, densely populated Chinese areas in North America.
True, but I guess it's just, you know, I mean, you're showing like one case where it's like, again, it's like eminent domain, for example. You're talking about like, again, like those come in and like take over because, you know, supposedly it's going to bring in something or other, tax revenue, whatever. But like, you know, when it comes to like affordable housing and like the homeless crisis, like there's a lot of communities, like for example, like I'm next door and I basically kind of grew up in like Seal Beach, right? I'm in Long Beach right now. Seal Beach is right around the corner. Seal Beach will fight tooth and nail if they're even here. There's one like, you know, possible like, you know, partial housing thing that's lower income. Like they'll go like, you know, completely to the trenches over that. So like there's again like, you know, yeah, it's like you don't want to open the door for like, you know, condo developments and ruining like, you know, neighborhoods and like gentrifying the hell out of everything. But there's also like, there is like these kind of hardcore insular types who just, they like their communities the way it is, hint, hint, dog whistle, white, and they won't be changing anything and they don't want poor people in no matter what. So.
Right, which is why I think there's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You have to actually sit there and contextualize what is it you're trying to, I mean, and I think that's I think that would be the general thrust of my gubernatorial run, is that like anything that, my general feeling is that anything that sounds like, well, this is just what should always be done is probably oversimplifying matters. Because again, like, yeah, I mean, here in San Francisco, you know, without putting too fine a point on it, you can find a number of neighborhoods where every window may have a Black Lives Matter sign, but behind the scenes in their brain, they're really like, as long as they're not trying to live their Black lives here. You know, I can sit here and it's very easy for me to make this kind of like progressive show out my window, but I certainly don't want to alter my neighborhood or my community in any way. And that can become very problematic. And so this is why I think there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution of just like, look, you need to just like, tell people in communities we're going to build this kind of housing here, because in some cases that may be appropriate, in some cases it may not be. And I think that's the kind of thing that has to be done with communication with local communities combined with a broader plan of development, regionally and California-wide. So,
Michael, I want you to pretend that you and I are on the CN Tower elevator in Toronto, Canada, and it's a large elevator, so you have plenty of time. Give us your pitch as to why you should be the next governor of California.
So I think, again, like I think primarily what it just comes down to is the two-party system is not helping California in the slightest. It's not capable of solving problems because the two-party system of California is fundamentally the two-party system of the United States. California is large, California is complex, California is globally significant. We can't treat it like Delaware. We can't treat it like Iowa. We can't treat it like North Dakota. It is a significant global power. And Democrats and Republicans in California seem to have no interest in that. So what we need is a party and we need candidates who are ready to recognize the importance of California, that will treat California seriously, not as simply an important piece on the large federal politics chessboard. You know, okay, maybe California is the queen of the U.S. chessboard, but you know, to sort of fall back on the famous early feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, you know, people talk about how we need to make California more important in U.S. politics. I don't want California to have more power over the United States. I want California to have more power over California. And as long as Democrats basically treat California as a place to cut their teeth to run for federal office, we could think of a few examples from the Democratic Party in this regard, or as long as Republicans basically see California as this place where they continue to struggle against the blue menace, nothing is actually going to get fixed in California. So what we really need is a party that's going to look for practical solutions. And again, you could sort of say, well, I've seen the third party horse before. I don't see any reason to get on board and ride it. But again, when we talk about third parties in California, we're primarily talking about the Greens or the Libertarians, parties that have a strict ideology. You either agree with them or you do not. The California National Party and this campaign is specifically about not telling Californians what they should want. It's about listening to Californians. What do Californians want? And I think on both sides, there's this kind of hyperactive mentality about defining Californians, like the idea of blue progressive California. I mean, I grew up with Duke Majan. I remember Pete Wilson. Like, California is not the Democratic bastion and stronghold I think a lot of people think it is. It's not the progressive stronghold everybody thinks it is. For example, Californians a few years ago had the decision, do we want to get rid of the death penalty or do we want to streamline it? And they voted by a majority vote to streamline it. We just had an election about affirmative action, and Californians rejected the reinstatement of affirmative action. Whether we agree with this or disagree with this, we need to actually listen to Californians and determine, why is it we think this way? Why is it we're supporting this? Why is it we're voting this way? And I think coming in with a strong ideological bent, whether or not it's progressive or conservative or liberal or socialist, coming in telling Californians who they should be and what they should want, I think that's not going to solve California's problems at all. We need a party and we need candidates who are willing to go back and say, what is this complex mess called California going to do about its own problems, which have nothing to do with what's going on out there in the United States? And I think we need candidates and a party that's going to sit down and say, we're focused on California.
I already know the answer to this, but I'll pretend and ask you, what are the main policies that you are going to be running on?
So, I mean, I guess
like the top three probably would be good, because I mean, like the platform for the California National Party, not to interrupt, sorry, but the California National Party has a very extensive platform I think people should check out, definitely, because again, it's very well thought out and there's a lot of stuff there. But I guess like narrowing it down to like the top 3 points would be probably great.
Yeah, and I mean, there's as Forbes was saying, obviously, like the California National Party platform has evolved. I mean, our first major platform was in 2016, and we do one every 2 years. There'll be another revision beginning this year for 2022. And I think the platform is always changing. And one of the things that does that is more types of Californians from different parts of California with different concerns are coming in and voicing that. The platform of the California National Party doesn't come in and say, this is what California should want. As we get more Californians in places like Tuolumne or Inyo or, you know, Shasta, it changes the makeup of the platform. And I think that's for the best, because then it does make the platform much more representative of California. Sorry, I'm going to pause for a second because there's a siren.
No worries. I have the same problem at times too.
But to answer your question, Bill, so, I mean, I think a lot of the major things, a lot of the major policies for the upcoming campaign are related to the failures we've seen in this past year during the pandemic on kind of making sure that Californians' lives can be maintained throughout these basically when civilization falls apart every now and then. So some of the major things we have are a monthly UBI, a $500 for every California citizen. So everybody gets it, from Mark Zuckerberg down to like the person outside my window right now, combined with a negative income tax, which specifically gets money to the people who need it. And what this does is this will replace the current costly and inefficient sort of social safety net system. You know, it gets rid of all these different, you know, because this was the biggest problem that so many of us, so many people I saw this year had, is they would have to apply for unemployment. They would have to apply for Medi-Cal, and then they would be offered a part-time job. And with that part-time job, they'd lose unemployment, and they'd be making too much money to get on Medi-Cal. So they'd have to ask themselves, should I take this job and lose my Medi-Cal and then have to start paying for covered California, which might mean I'm actually taking home less money than if I were on unemployment? These are just complex systems that are impossible to negotiate when disaster is struck. I mean, I myself applied for unemployment earlier this year, and I couldn't do it because I didn't have a smartphone that was registered in my name. I literally could not get unemployment because you can't go into the unemployment office. You need a smartphone where you take a picture of your ID and take a picture of your face and send it in with a smartphone registered to your name and send that into the EDD. And I didn't have one. I've still got a flip phone. So no unemployment for me. Like, this system is just so complex when people need it. When people need unemployment, they pretty much need it right now. When people need Medi-Cal, they pretty much need it right now. So having a system of UBI, which is a guaranteed monthly income, having a negative income tax, which gets money in the pockets of people who need it, having automatic Medi-Cal enrollment for all California residents, these things are there to replace this inefficient social safety net and have one that says, look, here's something you may not need most of the time, but when you need it, it's there for you and it's prepared and it's ready. You don't have to go through the rigmarole, this system that basically treats you like a criminal, proving your need before they'll give it to you. I think that system has just shown its failure time and time again.
Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
I was gonna say, what I love about the UBI, negative income tax, and Medi-Cal is it appeals to both left and right. You get people on the left who are like, hey, this is a really good social safety net. You know, this is going to help poor people. Republicans, and I don't get where Democrats lost the way and became inefficient in government, but like, I think it is a virtue. I don't think the Republicans practice what they preach, but the virtue that they say of efficient government and not wasteful spending, that should be nonpartisan. It's our money. We should want it to be spent in the most efficient way possible. The other thing I really love about UBI, negative income tax, you've been talking about how Democrats, the blue has failed the red in California. A UBI and a negative income tax, can you talk about how you think that'll help small businesses, which are also allegedly a pro-Republican thing? They've cornered the market on appealing to small businesses. How will this help local small towns and small businesses?
Actually, sorry, before we get into that, just really quick, this is a point of clarity. A negative income tax, how exactly does that work? Because again, like, you know, I understand that personally, but I just want to make sure that people listening understand exactly what that concept is and how, like, for example, you said it's going to replace a lot of like the, you know, the kind of, you know, pardon my language, half-assed like social network, social safety net that we have. How would a negative income tax exactly work? Like, this is a simple example for that.
Right. So in our specific example, a negative income tax is you set a limit at which no income is taxed at all. And so we set it at $40,000. So if you earn in wages $40,000 a year, you're not taxed at all. And if you earn more than $40,000, you are only taxed for what you make above $40,000. So if you make $50,000, you're only taxed on $10,000 of it. If you make less than $40,000, then the way a negative income tax works is that it basically makes up perhaps an example would be easier. So let's say, for example, you make $20,000 a year, and the baseline is $40,000. So you would be guaranteed a tax refund of half the amount between what you made and $40,000. So for example, if you made $20,000 and the limit's $40,000, you'd have a guaranteed $10,000 income tax return. If you made $30,000, you'd have a guaranteed $5,000 income tax return. If you made $38,000, you'd have a guaranteed $1,000 income tax return. If you made nothing, you'd have a guaranteed tax return of $20,000, which is half the difference between 0 and 40. And so what this does and why it works better than the current welfare system is you're always better off working. If you make $20,000 a year, you get $10,000, which means you have $30,000. If you make $30,000 a year and you get half of that, you get $35,000 a year. If you have $38,000, you get half of that back, you get $39,000 a year. So it's always advantageous for you to have some work. And as full-time work has declined, as so many of us, you know, myself included on occasion, have had to resort to getting a second or even third job, which is part-time, to supplement our income, this becomes beneficial because it encourages people to seek out that kind of work, to maintain some form of employment. And you're always going to be better off working. And so combined with a $500 a month UBI, it means every Californian winds up with a guaranteed minimum yearly income of $26,000 and a guaranteed untaxed income of $46,000. And it does all this while still encouraging work. It does all this by reducing all of the bureaucracy that comes with the unemployment system, that comes with all these systems where people have to seek financial assistance. It simply comes in based on your income level. So it radically simplifies getting money to the people who need it most in California society.
I'm going to say something. I know I've said this to Forbes before, and it may sound controversial, but if they say the average gang member or drug dealer makes about minimum wage a year, Imagine having the choice, if you're a gang member, of two options: committing crime, maybe getting shot, getting arrested, that stress, or getting a negative income tax and then being able to like find your way. That's going to reduce crime, I think, too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's 100% true. I mean, how do you argue with the logic there? Because people are always weighing their options. You know, I mean, unless they're just total maniacs, and there's always going to be some people like that, just toy out to lunch. But for the most part, I mean, like, yeah, I'm trying to get ahead or scrape by. Okay, yeah, like exactly what Bill said. Like, you get shot or drive by a rival dealer for BS money, or maybe I just do some negative income tax, or just get this negative income tax money, get the UBI. Maybe go to school, maybe do something else, maybe I am a little bit entrepreneurial. I mean, I guess, otherwise I'd be dealing drugs, and that's entrepreneurial in a way.
You got to have some business smarts to do that, no question.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's just you don't last too long, I guess. So, yeah. I mean, again, it does help out a lot of things, too. And it's just, and we're not even getting into the whole, like, automation thing, which is going to hit this state like a rocket one of these days, which is a major point of UBI, but that's neither here for right now.
Right, and I think fundamentally in the long run, what it's going to require is a rethinking of work. I mean, this is the thing about people treat the 40-hour work week like it's sacred, but the 40-hour work week didn't even really come about until the Great Depression, when there was a kind of share the work mentality, that if I was working 50 or 55 hours a week, if a number of us start working 40 hours a week, that gives somebody else the opportunity to have a job. And I think at this point, the 40-hour week has become somewhat absurd. I don't know if now exactly is the time to replace it, but I mean, it really doesn't make any sense. The whole idea of technological development in the workplace is that we're supposed to be getting more done in the office than we ever have before. Supposedly, with all this technology, when I go into work, I'm getting more done because of technology than my grandfather was. So why am I still working the same 40-hour week my grandfather was if I'm getting so much more done? Like, what is the purpose of it? What am I actually accomplishing by just this sacredness of the 40-hour week? And of course, the 40-hour week is so important to workers. Why? Because it's tied to things often like getting insurance, making sure that you make enough to stay, have a stable income. Whereas when you have something like immediate Medi-Cal, when you have something like UBI and negative income tax, these sort of barriers are removed. And getting back to Bill's question, I think that's one of the most important things for small local businesses in rural California, because one of the biggest problems that's come about, we talk about, here in San Francisco, there's, of course, everybody knows there's massive income inequality. One of the richest human beings on earth can walk out their door and step over somebody who's dying of an overdose. Like, there are a lot of problems with San Francisco, and that's just really a small part of the massive income inequality in California. And a big part of that income inequality that doesn't get addressed a lot is the disparity between urban and rural. And so one thing that UBI and negative income tax is going to do is it's going to take this economic benefit that has primarily been focused on the coast and on urban areas and move that money into rural communities so that rural communities can start opening community-owned local businesses, so that the people in those communities can start frequenting those businesses with their money and put it into those businesses. Those businesses will find it easier to open because they don't have to provide insurance for their workers, because their workers are already signed up automatically for Medi-Cal. So once you remove a lot of those barriers, and once you start pushing more money into rural and inland communities in California, you can start doing something about that massive, massive economic inequality that has developed in the technologically and real estate driven economies of the coastal and urban areas, and bring those benefits to the entirety of California. And I think that's why thinking of California unified is the best policy for making these sorts of decisions. Because Gavin Newsom came in trying to say, I'm going to be the governor for all of California, but he's done nothing to indicate that. I mean, he's literally just saying that, but the feeling of the Democratic Party is, if we're never going to win Lassen, if we're never going to win Del Norte, if we're never going to win Tehama, why should we give them anything? Why should we, the Democrats in power in Sacramento, look out for people in Siskiyou when they're just never going to give us the vote because they hate Democrats? And somewhat rightly so, considering how much Democrats have, in some cases, just neglected them, and in others just outright abused parts of so-called red rural California. So I think what you really need to do is you need to make this, we're the world's 5th largest economy, but you need to make that work for all Californians. And so that's, when we talk about historically marginalized communities, we're talking about communities, you know, in urban areas that have long been neglected. But I think we also need to bring on board with that rural communities that have lacked access to healthcare, that have lacked access to the justice system, that have lacked access to banking systems that would allow them to develop local businesses. I am a huge proponent of local businesses in general, and especially the development of local businesses in rural inland California, where the people there can start maintaining their own economies. And I think what can really jumpstart that are things like negative income tax and UBI, because those communities often are the ones who have the lowest per capita income in California.
You know, another way to think, I think of it, it may not make sense for someone in Ukiah right now to open a bakery because there's not enough money in the community. But if you add $2 million extra to that community each month, all of a sudden that is a great place to open up a bakery. And that's, you know, that's how the things work. So I agree with you 100%. Would you go on a ledge and say that the Democrats in California have given Republicans in red areas justification for not liking them?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that leads into another major part of the campaign is, I mean, if I'm living in Inyo County and they're just saying, well, here we go, we got to like redistribute some more water to Los Angeles County, you know, no offense, Forbes, but you know, if we got to Mole Holland things up a little bit and get some more money out of Inyo, well, Inyo's got what, one representative that they share with a bunch of other counties, and you know, Los Angeles has just dozens of representatives in the Assembly and the Senate, where they can just basically say, look, Inyo's just got to take another one for the team. You guys are less important. We got to make sure that these parts of California are doing okay. And we basically outvote you, so you're just going to have to deal with it. And I think that has led to a great deal of resentment. I mean, there's a reason why state of Jefferson feels the way it does, because they feel they've long been neglected by Sacramento. And I happen to believe they're right. Even if I don't believe with everything a lot of Jeffersonians may support, I do agree with their position that by and large, Sacramento has forgotten them. And that's problematic. And I mean, I've talked to people in the CMP, you know, from places like Tuolumne, like Inyo, you know, like Shasta, and a lot of them will say things like, look, there are Republicans out here. There are genuine, to-the-bone Republicans out here that you can't, you know, you'll never reach because they're just team red, and that's them forever. But for a lot of people out in those areas, they would just never be caught dead voting for a Democrat, because the Democrats are those people who represent urban coastal California, who go to Sacramento, who continue to take positions that at the very least don't benefit us, and in some ways actually actively harm us, and seem to have no concern about it because they've never had to come out to Amador. They've never had to come out to Plumas. They don't care about these people. They just sort of see them as the place where the water comes from, if we're lucky. And so I think that has led to a major disconnect through a Democratic-dominated government, and these people who feel like they've been left behind by it. And so I think that's why having a party and having a candidate that can say, look, this is a California unity party. This is a California unity message and a California unity candidate that says, we agree. The Democrats have been ignoring you, and there's nothing they're going to do that's going to stop that. But have the Republicans really been helping you? Especially as the Republicans become substantially more insignificant in California's governance. What does voting for a Republican get you? Oh, great, you can vote for one of those 7 members of the 40-member Senate, and they'll just be ignored. You know, there's a supermajority of Democrats in both houses of the legislature. Voting for a Republican does nothing for you anymore. And so this is why what you really need to do is decentralize the California government to a certain extent. Because Democrats have continually centralized things in Sacramento because they have power in Sacramento. And they want, you know, centralized power in the state government to be able to pass edicts on the rest of the state. But I think we need to end that. We need to go back to more locally accountable representatives. We need to have robust and reformed county government. You know, I mean, we've been so negligent on county government. Alpine County, with 1,200 people, has the same 5 members on the Board of Supervisors as does Los Angeles County with its 10 million people. Like, every member of the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles County is supposed to represent 2 million people. That's not representation. There's no way you can have effective representation on that level. Los Angeles County is bigger than 41 US states. Frankly, Los Angeles County probably needs its own elected county executive to deal with the problems that are there in such a large and 1 of every 4 Californians lives in Los Angeles County. Like, that's a staggering number. Like 10 million people, 1 in 4 Californians are there, with 5 members on the board of supervisors. And so you just can't have that sort of thing. You have to recognize that county government needs to be expanded and more responsive to the people who live there. Whereas again, what am I supposed to do if I live in Mono? Am I supposed to say, boy, I don't like what's going on over in Sacramento, but I can't vote for somebody new from Berkeley. I can't vote for somebody new from San Mateo. I can't vote for somebody new from Long Beach. I need representatives who are accountable to me. And so this doesn't mean we just completely get rid of centralized government. Obviously, things like civil rights, resource management, the environment, we need to have California-wide policies on that. But by and large, I would say Sacramento makes too many decisions for the rest of California. We need to really, first of all, increase the size of the California legislature. We need to have a much larger assembly and a larger Senate so that we have more representatives who are more locally accountable to their people. And we need to move more decision-making over to local communities so that they're able to determine what works best for them, and that they have representatives who make those decisions who are actually accountable to the voters. Because right now, you have Republicans who keep getting reelected in rural California who don't get anything done, but they say, I don't get anything done because of those damn Democrats in Sacramento, and it's all their fault that nothing gets done here. You start having more robust county representation. If things aren't getting done in your county, you know who to point the finger at, and you have the ability to replace them. So having more locally accountable and robust regional government, I think, is a key to having a functioning California.
One last thing, I think, because again, like, well, I don't know, Loebs, we're not trying to take up your time. Do you have some more time, or again,
I'm pretty much available. Well,
okay, dude, I just want to make sure, because we always have an hour's format, but the beauty of podcasting is we can always go later. But I just want to make sure, again, we're not like, taking up too much. One of the major kind of hot button things right now, especially, is that we've had the George Floyd killing. We've had multiple incidents across the country with I forget what his name was, the black Army lieutenant who got pepper sprayed and tased and abused. What is the name? I'm so sorry. The person who died because the cops thought that her taser was, or her gun was the taser. It just happened just a few days ago.
In Minneapolis as well.
Yeah, in Minneapolis as well. Police brutality is a major thing. What is your stance on how to kind of combat this? How does California, the governor of California, let's say your day one in office, again, this is a major issue. I mean, it could cause riots. It has caused riots. It has caused, major disruptions across the country, including California. Like my city, Long Beach, had a major riot because of the George Floyd. How would you try to reform the police? What are your thoughts on the issue of police reform?
I mean, I think issues around police reform, there's 2 ways to talk about that. There's the institutions of law enforcement itself, and then there's also the issues around, without putting too fine a point on it, beliefs that people come into with as they enter law enforcement, ideas about certain other types of people, certain types of class ideas. So you have both the issue of the people who are in law enforcement and the structure of law enforcement. I think there are 2 different ways that you have to deal with that. In terms of the structure of law enforcement, obviously the primary issue is one of accountability. And certainly, again, when talking about the sort of local control thing, you don't want to denigrate or remove the power that local county sheriffs, for example, or that local, city police departments, have as what's the word I'm looking for? Oversight over their communities. But certainly at a certain point, like the California Attorney General needs to get involved. If breaks are just so egregious, if the recurrences are just so common, that there needs to be something that sort of brings policing in there. Because just because people have local control over their sheriffs, or just because people, think that they should be able to have their police force funded in whatever way, they desire, at a certain point, all of this is subsumed under the execution of the law, which falls under the rubric of, a statewide California thing. So what you really need is more robust accountability given to, oversight by the Attorney General. You also need to address the major underlying cause, which is racism in society. And of course, part of the problem is, without putting too fine a point on it, racism in society in the United States is more or less strictly black and white. But California's racial past is just so much more complicated. And obviously, when you're talking about something specific like police reform, the major thing you're talking about is the Black community and the Latino community. But of course, as we've also seen in the last few months, like violence against the, Asian Californian community and the broader Asian North American community is something that isn't so obvious and systematized out of cops. It's one thing when like somebody uniformed comes and shoots you. It's another thing when just everyday citizens in plain clothes might come up and beat the living crap out of you, which is a very different kind of racism and structured differently than something like police racism. So you have the issue of the structure of the police department along with the issue of just underlying racism in society. Now, obviously, one of the things that you can do and what's been talked about is shifting resources away from police officers in places where police probably shouldn't be involved, especially here in San Francisco, things like mental health crises, where we've started moving away from this. The sort of militarizing of the police has been a major issue. But I think sort of like broad calls, and especially I think the phrase defund the police is just sort of like, that was just bad PR. That's just a bad way to phrase it. You're not literally defunding the police. You are transferring responsibilities away from the police into other departments and then taking that funding and moving it somewhere else. Defunding the police has this kind of like, left fist in the air sound to it, but it's not actually what you're doing. What you're doing is you're shifting responsibilities. And I think part of it, I'm not going to defend, obvious egregious examples of racism by cops, but part of it is also over the last few decades, society has demanded things from cops that were not cops' responsibility originally. They were originally the responsibility of family members, originally the responsibility of communities, originally the responsibility of finding health and medical care for people, and we've just all subsumed that under policing. And I think that is probably our fundamental issue, because it's become one of those when you've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail problem. And again, we need to contextualize. There aren't simple answers. We can't just do sort of the rights answer of society is collapsing before our eyes, let's give more money to cops because cops prevent the collapse, because sometimes the things cops do may in fact cause all sorts of social strife, which is exactly what the police are supposed to not be doing. And part of that is because of this emphasis on giving police a role that they're not supposed to have. So I think part of that is just, that's the structural aspect of policing, the aspect of just the racism that to this day still exists in California society. I will exist. I don't think the racism in California society by and large is as hard to deal with as it is in certain parts of the United States, but it is something that has to be addressed. And it's not going to be addressed if we continue to think of California as just this liberal progressive bastion where we're all holding hands singing Kumbaya around the fire. We need to have actual discussions and reckonings. And that does require breaking out of just sort of the white-black trope of the United States and recognizing the complex nature of racial interaction in California. That really comes from the fact that that California is substantially more diverse than any part of the United States that you would care to mention. And so combining this sort of reckoning that we need to have in California about racial interaction and ethnic interaction and religious interaction is going to need to tie into a restructuring of the police, moving sorts of responsibilities away from them and into places where people are much better served, like mental health crises, and just a lot more community support. I think one of the things that we talk about in the CMP platform, which may seem unrelated to this, but I think is fundamentally related to this, is giving tax breaks and financial support to caregivers. The reason you wind up with a lot of people on the street is because people are just like, look, I need to hold my job, and my husband needs to hold his job, and I need to take care of my other kids. If my kid is just like so mentally out there that it's just such a burden on me to take care of them, as much as I may hate to do so, I just have to absolve myself of that responsibility. And you meet people on the street, here in San Francisco, in downtown San Francisco where I live, you meet people who are just like, you should be in the care of family members, in the care of loved ones. This shouldn't be a responsibility of opening another sort of like, homeless shelter so that you have a place to go or locking you up in a mental asylum. This should be We need to give support to family caregivers. We need to give support so that these people aren't there on the street. And of course, that's not what we get. How many times have we heard the story of the family calling 911 and saying, my son is having a mental break, and the cops show up and shoot them?
Oh.
Like, we need to end that sort of thing. We need to make a greater effort to support families and communities to take care of people who need assistance at the beginning so they don't wind up on the street, so they don't wind up in places where what happens is somebody calls the cops and then feels bad because they got shot. I mean, this is a literal life story. I was downstairs the other day, you know, and this guy came up and he clearly was not very verbal. He clearly wasn't able to communicate very much. And like, I was sort of like, eventually, like, are you asking me for change? Or is that what you're asking me for? And he kind of nods, and I'm like, okay. And so I look through my pocket, and he pulls out this large knife, not in a violent way, not in a threatening way, almost in a kind of like goofy big grin. I've got a knife. And this guy clearly doesn't understand what he's doing. And I was sitting there, and I was kind of like, I don't want to call the cops on this guy because he's just going to walk out with his knife, and the cops are going to shoot him. And it's not like other people I see on the street don't have knives. If I were on the street, I would have a knife as well. This guy is clearly so far gone, he doesn't have that social construction. He's just looking at this guy he wants change from and showing off his knife. And this is the kind of person who should have a support network, not a support network that is like a government-run facility, but a support network of family, a support network of a community. When you have that, that is a lot stronger than any sort of government institution. And I mean, not to, you know, to kind of get back on Gavin Newsom, I think this is what he doesn't understand. I remember listening to a speech from Gavin Newsom talking about, you know, because Gavin Newsom is famous here in San Francisco for his Care Not Cash program. We'll stop giving money to the unhoused, and we'll house them, and we'll give them food and give them shelter. And it didn't work because a lot of people didn't want to live there. And Gavin Newsom was just like, well, I don't understand this. I don't believe this. There's nobody who wouldn't want to live in institutionalized housing. And that's just nonsense. If you're somebody with PTSD that you got from the institutionalized housing from when you were in the military, if you've been in and out of jails or orphanages or mental facilities, institutionalized housing seems dangerous. You don't want to live in institutionalized housing. You're stuck in there. You want to be out where you can feel you have control of your life. And it's just like, Gavin Newsom, have you even just spoken to one person with PTSD in a corner store who will happily tell you why they're not in institutionalized housing? And of course, no, he hasn't. And so again, there's complexity to this issue. We can't just sort of roll out solutions and then be confused when not everybody wants to go along with it. And so again, the issue of like police reform, the issue of racism that's sort of built into the structure of society, which then bleeds into police, all of this is all intertwined together with mental health services, with a lack of support for communities and community-based care. I mean, all of these are just, you know, they're just richly woven together in a way that I don't think there are simple solutions unless you're willing to look at it holistically. So that was kind of a long answer, but there it is.
I will tell you, as you know, a parent with a child with special needs, that is a hidden story that people do not report. The police officer shooting people with special needs. My son is nonverbal. He would not respond to a police officer. That's my biggest fear, is him.
Yeah, and it's horrifying too. I mean, it could go south in, you know, just the easiest ways. We see it multiple times. I mean, there's too many stories actually to relate at this point.
And I think when you're talking about defunding the police and the messaging, I agree. I also agree, you know, there should be more social workers. A social worker should be on the beat with a cop. If they're in, you know, or you have someone, not all, like, we shouldn't have as militarized as police as we have. Those should be social workers. The other thing, and I'm going to support the police a little here. They are fighting the drug war, a war that they cannot win. They're undermanned. They are undertrained. I hope when you become governor, I hope that police have to spend 10 hours a week either doing training or volunteering with the Police Athletic League. Something where they're actually in the community doing something other than arresting people. These are things that would, nonpartisan things, which is really what the CMP is about, that could be practical solutions. And we're not going to solve all the problems. Like you said, there are some people who are going to be homeless because they don't want to be part of society anymore. We got to find ways to integrate them into society. But you're absolutely right. Like, my dad served in Vietnam. He was in special forces. And, you know, he got through his depression, all that, but, you know, a couple turns the wrong way, he could have just as easily been homeless. You know, when you have special training and military training, living on the street isn't that hard. You know what I mean? In the sense that you've survived worse than that. So no, we definitely as a society just need to reach out to people and listen and be like, hey, you know, person who does not have a home or, you know, a job right now, what can we do to help you, rather than just thinking we have the solution. I got to ask you, since you are a professor, what do you see as the educational problems in California, and what are some solutions you would have to it?
So I think one of the, I mean, obviously one of the huge issues, and you know, this is there we are, we're on the 6 degrees of California separation, kind of how long you got. But I mean, obviously the biggest issue is just without saying what should be done about it, the California education system never recovered from Prop 13. The California public school system never figured out how to deal with that loss of revenue from local property taxes. And as somebody who went to school throughout the 80s, I was always just like a step ahead of the collapse of the California public school system, and just like the price expansion that eventually hits when you get into you know, the university level and stuff like that. Like when I was doing my undergraduate in the mid-aughts, it was still affordable to go to a California public university. Like a normal human being could still do it. And that has sort of disappeared. So I think one of the things that we need to do is, first of all, again, right now, California is in a lot of ways tied to the American education system. We got to get we have to get our own tax revenue back from the United States. We're stuck with the Texas curriculum, where we're stuck with books that are geared to sell in the rest of the United States and sort of leave our children underperforming. And I think also we need to take a different approach to education. I mean, because let's be honest here. I mean, and this is another one of those. It seems like very mundane, but it's definitely one of those places where I definitely think we need to have a lot more local control, setting the time frame for public education works. I was one of those kids who had to show up at 7:50 in the morning for junior high and high school, and I was useless. I was utterly useless. It was impossible for me to learn anything at 8 a.m. It's still impossible. It's impossible for me to do almost anything at 8 a.m. You know, but it was, you know, it's tied into sort of like this outdated idea of like, well, here's when parents need to get to their job. Here's how long we watch. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's still based on the idea that school lasts at this amount of time. Then you go home and mom is at home baking something from the Betty Crocker cookbook, waiting for you to get home. And that's just not reality anymore. So like even just simple things like the structure of our schools, we should have things that allow students to go to earlier sessions that run from something like 8 to 3 p.m. and students who go to later sessions that run from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or something like that, which would increase their ability to learn. It would also give their parents more flexibility when their kids go to school, when they get home from school to pick up their kids, when education best serves them. And this seems like a very small, mundane thing, but I think it's fundamentally important because the schedule these kids are on day after day after day of their lives for 12 years. I mean, sort of a personal story. I'm a high school dropout. I took the California High School Proficiency Exam when I was 15 and I passed, and I was like, heck with this. And I started at the community college when I was 16 and I did so much better. Why? Because I could set my own schedule. I didn't have to show up at 7:30 or 7:50 in the morning. I could take an afternoon class when I was awake and my mind was open and I could learn these sort of things. So I think in terms of just like fundamental structure, that's really important. Obviously, just what we've been talking about for decades, funding for smaller class sizes, for more teacher retention, you know, for keeping students engaged. And, you know, obviously coming out of the pandemic, we have seen the results of the massive income inequality on education. Like just lack of access to basic things like I'm in a rural area and we don't have broadband. How are you expecting me to be on a Zoom call? I don't, you know, I'm in an inner city and I don't have a laptop. What am I supposed to be doing? You know, and even if you give me one, I may not know how to use the bloody thing. So all of these sorts of inequalities come about that are a result of just simply looking at, you know, and all of this comes out of, you know, sort of like the no student left behind. I think my favorite phrase about it was Delane Easton, who was formerly superintendent of schools here in California. She ran for governor in 2018. I think she's going to go down as the best governor California never had. If she were in charge right now, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. But she was superintendent of schools, and when they asked her, what can you do about education? She said, the fundamental problem with California education is that they seem to think the way you fatten a pig is by weighing it a lot. Like, we just have these sort of standardized tests where it's like, hey, can you get 50% plus 1 on this test? All right, well, that's enough. You memorize that for now. Let's move you on to the next thing. And we're sort of teaching kids how to regurgitate certain things to move on to the next level without having a holistic sense of learning how society works. Like, I think that's the most important thing you can teach any student in K through 12, and especially once they reach, college level. And so kind of to get to the CMP policy and my own campaign policies on this is one thing we really need to try to assure is free community college with expansion in rural areas who have been substantially underserved, because that's the hardest thing about being a student in a rural area in community college. So many of my students, when they're in community college, were able to keep living with their parents. But if your nearest community college is 150, 200 miles away, something like that, you're not going to be living with your parents. A lot of rural community colleges have dorms because of how far away it is that you can't be living with your parents. So we should have at least a satellite campus of every community college, in every county. Maybe you might have to go for like more specialized classes to other places. We should be increasing, virtual remote education, which of course we've all gotten more used to. And we have this free community college, which kind of guarantees you, if you go through it, an AA degree, and it should be combined with vocational training. We definitely do not treat vocational training as something respectable in California. Everybody's supposed to become a computer programmer, or everybody's supposed to become a real estate agent. We need electricians. We need plumbers. We need carpenters. We just need basic, simple, straightforward vocational skill. And honestly, one thing I think that could really help, and I'm probably going to get a lot of flack from my union about this, I think we need to be honest. Maybe not everybody should go to a 4-year. Because the thing is, originally a 4-year into an academic discipline. And the reason, here's the great scam. Back in the 60s and 70s, you needed to have a high school diploma. It started to become sort of like, if you wanted to take a sort of like serious job or a professional or grown-up job, you had to have a high school diploma. And if you went and got a college diploma, that was sort of this like added bonus, this feather in your cap, it might move you into higher echelon jobs. Now, we have this idea everybody should go to college, and this was a noble idea that everybody should go to a 4-year college. But what does it end up doing? It makes a 4-year degree in the early 21st century the equivalent of a high school degree in the 60s and 70s that lots and lots of people possessed. The difference was a high school degree was free. Now, these students are getting into massive debt. They're signing these documents when they're 18 or 19 years old to get in debt for the next 10 or 15 years of their lives to get this degree that they've been told is necessary to get a professional job. And, my partner, God love her, like, that's one of my favorite statements of hers. She talked about, I hate how they call it financial aid because it makes it sound all warm and fuzzy. It's a diploma mortgage. You're basically mortgaging for this degree that you're going to pay off for the next 10 years. And I think, honestly, one thing we could do about that is one thing that we've done here in California, which I think has been really useful, is the ban the box, where you don't have, you don't require people to say whether or not they've previously served time in jail or whether or not they're a felon. So you don't have this kind of prejudice against people who are applying for jobs. I think we should make it that people who apply for a job cannot be asked about their educational background unless it is clearly and directly related to the task they have to do. If you're showing up for an office job with only a high school degree, but you can do it better than someone who's got a 4-year degree, you shouldn't be allowed to ask, what was your educational background? You should only be able to ask, can you do this job? And what it's done by having everybody ask about education is it's caused a cultural prejudice against people with 4-year degrees. And so I see it at San Francisco State. So many working class kids who could have a good job right now. They're intelligent, they're hardworking, but they feel they have to do another 2 years at this 4-year degree granting institution, taking 16 or 17 units a semester because they have to get through it so quickly because it's so expensive. And they don't really learn anything. They just need, as we say at college, C's get degrees. Nobody's going to ever ask for my GPA again. They just want to see that I got that diploma. And so you go through taking as many units as you can, as fast as you can, because it's so expensive, and you retain nothing just so that you can supposedly get that job that requires a 4-year degree. So I think if we change that aspect of employment, we could definitely make California focusing on a free community college system with vocational training.
That's what I was just going to ask you, actually, to be honest. Yeah, I was going to ask you how you felt about the free community college system. Actually, I would even go further because, you know, again, like, you know, you and I, again, I think we're on the same page. We like history lessons. We like to understand where we came from. We like to understand, like, the process of history. California colleges, for the most part, more or less, were relatively free. Yeah, the 4-year system. Again, like, I don't know exactly when the change was, but maybe it was Prop 13, maybe kind of helped kill that off a bit.
Oh, for sure. And
yeah.
actually, what is it? We have in the poli-sci department at San Francisco State, where I teach, we have a Matt Stoltz, I think it's Matt's, a Matt Stoltz award, where it basically pays for your entire tuition for the semester except $60, which is what he paid per semester when he was getting his degree at San Francisco State in the 50s or something like that. And it really wasn't that long ago. When I started at community college in 1997, it was $8 a unit at Ohlone College. It was $24 to take a 3-unit class. Like,
yeah, sorry. It was like my professor Kaskla, he went to Cal State Long Beach as I did. I'm an alumni. And he said that in 1983, I think his entire tuition for a semester, again, this could be just my misrecollection, so don't quote me on this, but he told me it was $85 for the semester. Mm-hmm. But again, like, what changed? Again, like, but Prop 13, by the way, was already kicked in for quite a while by then, right? I mean, if it's 83, like, when did Prop 13 come in? Like 70?
Prop 13 came in 78, but it took about a decade of readjustment before everybody kind of got used to it. Because once it passed, I mean, you don't just like flip a switch and then suddenly California's public education system deals with a lack of local property taxes. It took a long time for people to readjust. And for a while, people were trying to keep up the level of quality of education without raising prices, but then that didn't work out. I mean, what we do in a lot of colleges now, especially where I teach at San Francisco State, is we have international students. We focus on recruiting international students because they pay an arm and a leg to come to San Francisco State University.
That's true. My wife was an international student from Japan, and she had to pay through the nose to be at Cal State Long Beach. Yeah,
exactly. And you know, that's one, you know, and whether one favors that or not, and certainly I have no problems with California's, you know, higher education system being the envy of the world, but it was also designed for Californians. And I think it should definitely be geared toward making sure Californians get the education they deserve. And again, I think producing a free, you know, non-mandatory, because I mean, that's where you get in the issues. It's like, okay, high school is free, but it's mandatory. You know, when you're 15, 16, 17, the idea of like pushing up against that is very chafing. You know, when you have a community college where you can set your own schedule, where you can determine what it is you're going to study, I think that is just, it fundamentally changes your approach to education. When it becomes no longer this like mandated thing on this schedule set by these forces that run the school, but it becomes something you have a certain amount of autonomy over, then I think that encourages people. And I would love it if more Californians went and learned how California's political system worked as part of their AA. If they learned something about California history. And of course, as you might imagine, that's my big deal, is in high school, you know, and in community college, we primarily teach you about U.S. history. We primarily teach you about how the U.S. government works. You know, and I can't tell you how many people, you know, I teach in the political science department, and so many people I know who teach American government, they don't even touch California government. But I mean, by and large, these kids there in the CSU system are Californians. Very few people are coming out from Iowa to go to CSU Stanislaus. Like, especially in the UC system, it's a little different. But in the CSU system, those are by and large Californians. And we should be teaching them about California because they're usually coming from California and are planning to stay in California. And sort of re-emphasizing our education system toward California, again, away from sort of like federal education guidelines, away from the Texas curriculum, which you know, is for people who are listening and are unaware, almost all textbooks in the United States are geared to be allowed to be taught in Texas, because Texas is one of the largest education markets in the United States. And so, you know, California ends up just having to use those same books. I think that's highly problematic. And I think California really needs to start looking at California's education on its own, you know, individually away from the American system.
There was one thing you said, I just want to go back to it really quick to reiterate. 4-year schools, people who graduate with a 4-year degree, 40% of them get a job that has nothing to do with their degree, and 60% of those people are underpaid for the job that they are getting when they graduate. So the myth of get that 4-year degree to become successful is a real myth. I think, and you know, I know you're a professor, so forgive me, I think it's a scam to get people in to spend all this money, to be tremendously in debt, and to not have the opportunity that maybe their parents did. And when you're talking about trade schools, and we talked about automation before, AI is coming around the corner that's going to be able to do computer coding. There's the jobs that are going to be hard to automate are plumbers, electricians, you know, jobs where you have to use your fingers. And these are usually good union paying jobs. So
great jobs in some cases, yeah.
So the idea of promoting trade schools, I think not only just a good moral thing, but it's really good for our economy to build a strong middle class, is to have an army of unionized or trade, you know, ability to put in solar panels, to put in windmills, to, you know, welders. There's all sorts of these great middle class jobs. I'll quote my inner Andrew Yang. Was it Mike Rowe from Dirty Jobs? When he was running for president, he wanted to get Mike Rowe, the host of Dirty Jobs, to go around and like promote the virtues of, you can make $90,000 a year going and fixing things in the sewer. You know, you can, you know, morticians make great money. Like there's all sorts of really good middle, like what we would want to consider the middle class jobs that could be done through trade school. So
yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, Mike Rowe, I mean, like, I think he's kind of like, you know, he's a hack and half a fraud, but like, you know, broken clocks and all that. He was exactly right about that. There is fantastic jobs where, again, you have to use your hands and actually get out there and actually, you know, if you have the actual skills that was brought about by a trade school, like you're going to make a decent living. I know tons of plumbers and electricians who are living much better than any kind of office drone would ever be living. So again, it's a legitimate point. It's just something we should kind of emphasize, and hopefully that we get more people on board with, you know, getting into these programs that would actually be of help instead of just like, you know, steering them into what seems almost to be like, again, slightly shysterous, you know, schemish, kind of like, yeah, you know, you're going to rack up, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, and then you end up, you know, basically doing like a $15 an hour job.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting on both your points, because, yeah, I mean, on both points that you brought up, I mean, the woman I was in a relationship with in my early 20s, she was at Berkeley. She did 2 years at Berkeley, and then I went a year or so after that, or maybe like right at the same time she graduated. I can't remember now. But before she started at Berkeley, she was a receptionist at a law office. And then after her 2 years, you know, because we both transferred over from the city college, after her 2 years at Berkeley, she got out and got a job as a receptionist at a legal office. Like she literally got out doing the exact same job that she was doing before she started at Berkeley. And I'm not saying, you know, I mean, getting a college degree is not just about getting a better paid job. It's about becoming a, you know, more holistic, well-rounded human being. And I think just focusing on the idea that it's supposed to get you better pay is a bad one. But if we're looking at it in just that sense, yeah, I mean, it's clearly not serving that purpose. And also in terms of automation, no. I think, I mean, I'm a little, I understand the perils of automation. I'm a little bit less of the singularity is eminent type than some other people I know in California. But I will say my very first job when I was 15 was I was a web designer. I worked for a company that did web design for local businesses and local city government. And we were also an ISP. And we invented an early version of Pandora, which didn't get popular because Pandora is not very effective over a 56K modem, as you might imagine. But yeah, like the job I had when I was 15 as a web designer, like Wix does that now. You know, GoDaddy Commerce does it now. Like they just give you something that lets you build your web page. Like that that HTML I used to have to do, that simple JavaScripting I used to have to do for web pages in 1997, the computer just does it itself now. And that sort of thing is going to become more prevalent. You know, and yeah, obviously, once you know, automated vehicles are also going to radically change a number of these things. But yeah, so I think that again ties in to this idea of how many hours of work, how many hours a week do we all think we should be working? You know, how do you deal with UBI? Because I think that's also fundamentally the problem, is that I am a big proponent of this idea that you can't pay people to do nothing. Like, not in the like Republican, like, oh, you can't pay people to just sit around and live off welfare. I mean, I believe people are fundamentally doers. Like, if you just give people money to stay alive, they will, you know, I mean, it's a little too Kurt Vonnegut player piano. But I do believe if you just give money to people to stay alive, they'll wonder, why am I bothering to stay alive just to keep putting food in my mouth at a regular interval? People want to feel useful. People want to feel involved. People want to feel like they're doing something, which is, again, the benefit of a system which encourages people to pick up part-time work, which encourages people to volunteer because they're getting that UBI, which encourages people to do other things because they've got that UBI, because they've got that negative income, which doesn't discourage them from working. It allows us to look at work in a new way. And I think that's going to be necessary for 21st century California. Again, and this is the thing, I actually don't think UBI and negative income tax would necessarily work in the United States. And because it won't work in the United States, nobody's going to talk about it, because all we care about is what we got to talk about: Medicare for all. I don't care about Medicare for all or whether or not it would work in the US, but I know Medi-Cal for all would work in California. I don't care about whether or not UBI would work in the United States, but I'm pretty damn sure it would work in California. And as long as our politics keeps emphasizing the United States, what will work in the United States, what will benefit us in the United States, what will get us more victories for Team Red or Team Blue in the United States, we're not asking questions about what will work in California. And again, here we are. We're a land with a larger economy and more people than Canada. This has always been one of my like confused statements when people are like, yeah, I think I like California leaving the US, but you know, we should probably try to join Canada or something like that. I'm like, we've got a bigger economy than Canada and more people than Canada. They'd be joining us. Like, it looks impressive on a map, but like globally speaking, California is substantially more important than Canada. And
right.
Canada,
that argument is
political parties which emphasize their own interest, and we don't even have one. So like this whole idea of like not treating ourselves like the nation that we fundamentally are, I think that's the biggest problem facing.
Well, that's extremely true. I mean, we're still treating ourselves like a 19th century, you know, far west, you know, settler state kind of thing. We were not treating ourselves like a nation, which we definitely are. Number one. Number two, again, like I always heard people say that. I'm like, why would you think the Canadians would want us? We would just swamp them. You know, we would have so much more, and like, you know, we would just be completely with our own values and system, like overwhelming their entire values and system. I mean, it's such a ridiculous exercise. Again, like, you know, we are a place that is the 5th largest economy in the world. We beat so many, you know, other more recognizable states recognizable nations. And, you know, people just are not wrapping their head around this. Again, like, you know, they just kind of think it's a state. Again, it's like, it's a subdivision of the United States. It's just going to be like this kind of like somehow a little part. But again, like, we're much bigger and we have much bigger problems to deal with. And right now we have the albatross of the United States government around our neck. Like, it's causing major problems there. And that's something that neither the Democrats or Republicans want to talk about whatsoever for multiple reasons.
Right. And I mean, I think that's what it fundamentally comes down to. Like, the United States is never going to fix California's problems, and California is never going to fix its own problems if it's obsessing with the United States. So, I mean, I think just
that's a good way to sum it up. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and again, like, you know, and that's the thing. I mean, no matter how much you may be involved in American politics, like, Bernie's not going to fix PG&E for us. Like, these are issues we got to take care of here at home. And again, I have to admit, that's one of the things that like really grated on me a little bit and just sort of showed like how California thinks about itself and how the United States thinks about California was when people like Stacey Abrams and Bernie Sanders came out against the recall as this sort of big Republican ploy to seize power. And it's like, okay, first of all, it's none of your damn business. Like, why do I care what this person in Vermont or this person in Georgia has to say about the California recall. Like, no disrespect to either of them. Look, if Stacey Abrams wants to talk about Star Trek, I'm there. I'll talk about Star Trek with Stacey Abrams until the day comes to an end. But why do I care what she thinks about what Californians should be doing in California? If Californians want to have a recall, it's none of Bernie Sanders' business. It's none of Donald Trump's business. It's none of Stacey Abrams' business. It's our business. And the second point is the whole reason Bernie Sanders and Stacey Abrams feel that they have a right to talk about what's going on in California is, again, this idea that we're just an important chess piece in this federal game between the Democrats and the Republicans. We're not. We're not just a mere chess piece to this battle 3,000 miles away. We are significant. We are important. We can't just sit here and keep thinking of ourselves as an adjunct to the United States. And this whole attitude that, like, Bernie and Stacey Abrams feel like they have the right to come in and say, hey, you got to vote against the recall because it's bad for Democrats in the United States. I think I should have the right as a Californian to say, I don't give a damn about Democrats in the United States. You guys got to figure out how to win Ohio again. You guys got to figure out how to keep the Midwest together. We are California with California problems, and it's our business to try to deal with them, not yours.